So before we kick off, I just want to highlight the main aim of today's gathering, which is really to bring together various communities of practice which play a critical role in the realization of housing rights. Some of you do so by reframing what housing rights mean today, others advancing their realization by claiming or producing them on the ground. It is, I think, worth reminding ourselves that we are having this conversation at a critical and pivotal point in history. And this is not only marked by the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the fore the fundamental role that housing plays in the protection of life, and also the strong reemergence of race and gender as two crucial dimensions in the realization of housing rights. Today, I think we are also forced to rethink housing rights in light of two massive global challenges, which are deeply interconnected. On the one hand, clearly and without doubt, the increased financialization of housing, a machine that sees trillions of dollars invested in residential property across the globe, deepening housing needs and driving up wealth inequality, a story we know. What is more shocking is that this process continues to be subsidized through tax breaks and bank bailouts, while we see in parallel public spending on social housing being slashed. Unregulated global capital has in recent years not only distorted housing markets all over the world to a level that now excludes and expels poor and middle income families from what are regarded as prime locations, but it has also increased housing precariousness on an unprecedented scale. On the other hand, the intersection between climate change and housing rights presents two formidable challenges. First, tackling the heavy contribution of the construction sector to global emissions, which adds another layer of challenges to how housing deficits and the maintenance of existing social housing are approached. This, I would argue, urges us to explore ways not just of building, but also of retrofitting, repairing, rehabilitating and redeploying existing housing stocks. Second, by confronting the massive wave of forced evictions and displacement that are being exacerbated and executed worldwide in the name of risk. Paradoxically, this process is justified as a means to protect life, but in reality, what we see is a process of clearing the land in economically profitable spots to make place for speculative real estate developments. The right to housing and to adequate housing actually was recognized as part of the right to an adequate standard of living back in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is 72 years ago. Now, housing rights, of course, have been reinforced over the years by several international conventions and by the increased recognition of what Sean Turner several decades ago called the process of housing by the people, further propelled by the International Year of Shelter for the Homeless in 1987 and the subsequent global strategy to shelter to the year 2000, we see housing rights becoming over time prominent on the human rights agenda of the United Nations, but not only. Further significant layers of progress towards the actual realization of housing rights on the ground were also driven simultaneously by many of the networks present in this meeting, HIG, SDI, and ICHR among them. But still today, we witness large masses of the urban poor push into a state of what we could call bare or unhoused citizenship. Housing rights are now more than ever at the fore of the struggles we face and increasingly endangered through old and new machines of massive evictions, displacement, and dispossession. Yet we also witness the consolidation and emergence of multiple ways of activating housing rights as actual entitlements. In recent months, we have seen this happening through massive bold changes. And I think in the context of COVID-19, this has involved, not everywhere, but in many contexts, sweeping measures to tackle homelessness, to redeploy existing housing, set up rental and mortgage holidays, suspend evictions, and so forth. But a critical question in this sense is how to sustain, deepen, and expand these measures beyond the pandemic. Housing rights can not only be protected under emergency conditions, that is clear to all. I want to reiterate the fact that 2020 marks a very particular moment. This is the 75th anniversary of the UN system and also marks 2 decades since the first UN Special Rapporteur for Housing Rights was appointed. This year offers a moment of critical reflection about the international infrastructure we rely on the one hand, for the defense of housing rights, and the mushrooming efforts securing the realization of those rights on the ground. This, I would say or argue, is a key moment to reflect collectively on what works and what needs to change, and hence the point of this meeting. So in looking back, we ask what has changed in the way we're approaching housing rights. In looking forward at the actual tactics we deploy in claiming and producing housing rights, we ask how are our responses to advance housing rights evolving or forced to evolve? We have an amazing line of speakers to reflect on these 2 questions. So without further delay, I would like to give the floor to Emilia Sais, Secretary General of UCLG, and a crucial ally in the struggle to firm housing rights, again, strongly on the agenda. Emilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and greetings, colleagues from the different parts of the world. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, thank you for acknowledging me as an ally. We, local and regional governments, the constituency that I represent, we also know that we are part of the problem. So we are part of the problem, and I think a critical ally in the solution. And since the panel that I'm going to facilitate is a panel about what has changed and transformation, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview from our perspective, from the perspective of local and regional governments, from the international umbrella of local and regional governments. We have started to see, and this is always in the perspective of change. I mean, housing has always concerned us from the perspective of urbanization, urban mobility, slums. This was the part that was really critical for us in the international arena as a constituency. And then slowly, we have started to realize that our main problem was the commodification. And it was a problem not only for the communities that our constituency needs to serve, the citizens, the inhabitants, but it has also become a problem for the local and regional governments themselves, because commodification has been something that has also affected the sphere of government. If the people see housing sometimes just as a good that they can buy as an investment, we have also perceived from our constituency land where you build houses, etc., like Adriana was explaining, as a very big source of income as well. And this has been a very critical issue that is also behind evictions. We have gone through a period in which we were seen very much also as a technical sphere of government, as a technical level of government that needed to look at technical solutions for things. And that was also the prisma that we were using for the housing issue. Obviously, I am simply oversimplifying because there are different cases in the world that many of you know well. But this was the general approach of our movement to this, with some very critical exceptions. I think then that the global financial crisis came and really changed our prism of this, because it became an issue not only of the global south, but also very much of the global north. The whole process towards the Habitat 3 agenda has marked us and our alliance with more clear alliance with civil society. And now COVID is here. And this pandemic has also put this magnifying glass in the type of problems that we had. So While there have been champions in our constituency that have always seen housing from the perspective of rights, I have to confess that having worked with local governments for over 20 years, this was not the majority of our movement. I think this is the change that we can perceive, and this is what is behind the Cities for Adequate Housing a coalition that we have built up, and some of the critical political demands that many local governments around the world are making. This is also why United Cities and Local Governments is very keen to partner with you, with everybody here in this room, and sees housing as a very critical cornerstone of any future agenda for development. So it is from that perspective that I would like to look at the discussion, and building on your extensive experience on the matter, I would like to focus on that. What is changing in this narrative? I think that the change of narrative is very important. We shouldn't be stopping there. Is there change? Are we right about it or not? Raquel, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, needs no introduction. Is this the way that you are experiencing this? Do you see an evolution? Do you see a change in the way that we are approaching housing rights?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Who knows what time is it? Thank you so much for this invitation and for the privilege of sharing this panel with you, with some friends, and for the initiative. Unfortunately, I think that my intervention is not very optimistic, but let me just phrase that the framework of right to housing as part of the general view that rights refer not only to civic political rights, but also to economic, social, and cultural rights, the so-called second generation of rights. That whole idea came together, was part of a large package which included and was centered on the welfare state. So the idea of a central role for the state to promote economic, social, and cultural rights, and also international cooperation, because we are talking about an international level as well. And all this conception led to promoting and a very important role for the state to promote and provide housing as a promoter and as a very active promoter in very different ways, using different strategies. But that started to be absolutely dismantled. That was dismantled, and the temporalities are very different from country, from region to the other region. But we can see, and it's very clear how much we witnessed that at the end of the 70s or 80s or 90s, and it's still an ongoing process in some countries, ongoing process of dismantling not only the welfare state as it was, but also the ideas and the conceptions that fed the idea of a welfare state. And that includes the right to adequate housing as a human right and other socioeconomic rights. So the whole movement of privatization and commodification of housing, of education, of health, this is a part of an ongoing process that, yes, we all know that led to an acute housing crisis everywhere. You could say, oh yes, the welfare state was a reality in countries here in the center of capitalism and also in the experiences of socialism. but not in the periphery of capitalism in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. Yes, it's true, but also it was a dream. It was a utopia that was there. And that utopia also was very important politically. That also was dismantled everywhere. And the transformation of housing into a commodity and into a financial asset became the main motto, not only of the private sector of housing providers, but also of public policies. So local governments and national governments, regional governments were active promoters of the financialization of housing and still are. So this is very important because that had different phases, promoting home ownership, privatization of public housing, no more building public housing, and mortgage, and this side of the policies. But also now, after the 2008 crisis and the whole clash and the housing crisis that came together with the clash of financialization of housing, now we have the new wave of financialization of housing, which is rental housing. And again, and again, local governments and national governments promoting rental housing. Again and again, the international cooperation promoting the idea that now rental housing is the issue and we have to have corporate landlords to enter into the sector, among other policies. So in order not to stop here with this tragic picture, I would say that there is one very important change. And the change I see is in the level of the civil society, or the ones who are affected by the financialization of housing. And that I include all the housing social movements that existed long before in the periphery of capitalism, fighting and struggling for housing, who had in fact incorporated more and more the framework of right to housing into their practices, but also the emergence, and this is very interesting, the emergence of a new wave and a new generation of housing movements in places where this didn't exist for many decades. And then, yes, I am referring to several countries in Europe and cities in Europe, in the United States, who are now seeing an emergence of a new generation of a social movement, which again, it's incorporating the right to housing into the framework. This is the hope. Okay. This is what can bring change to this picture.
Okay, Raquel. So hope, change and hope in the level of readiness and the capacity of the civil society movements, and stagnation and wrong policies in the sides of governments a bit. That's where your main concerns lie. Let us go and see whether Ruth identifies with some of these things, or whether from your perspective that there is another way of looking at this. Any change to be identified, and pick up on Raquel as well. Do you identify with this increasing empowerment of civil society?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It's caused me to reflect on my history at some length, and I think I'd actually like to go back to that a little bit, because we've been talking about what's been learned from the previous history, and where does that move forward. And I think I first got involved in 1980 by going in and hanging out in a community of people who had captured land on a hillside in Jamaica. And I learned a lot from them about how they were financing things, how they were dealing with the land, how they were building. And I got kind of angry about quite a lot of that stuff. And one thing led to another. And a few years later, I found myself going to a UN conference, but trapped in a taxi with my Minister of Housing. And I hadn't had that experience before. And I think I started spouting, you know, you need to sort this out, you need to sort that out, we need to have land, we need to da da da. And eventually he sort of stopped, you know, he was very polite and he said, I totally agree. Could you please tell me how? And when I look back at the history, I went back and I reread the Limuru Declaration, which was the declaration that led to the reformulation of Habitat International Coalition in 1987. And it's a terrific document. It realigned things in all sorts of ways, and the International Year of Shelter for the Homeless brought a whole generation of civil society activists together over that year. But if you look at the documentation, it is full of shoulds and musts and things that people have to do. But there is very, very little about how to do it. And I think my experience with many of the colleagues with whom I worked over especially the 19 or 20 years that I was at Homeless International, was that we worked in relationships to work on the how. And we didn't spend a lot of time talking about rights, except when we were part of one delegation or another to UN Habitat and we needed to engage with that language. What we were very concerned about was the processes and the mechanisms and the techniques, if you like, of actually making a difference. And Homeless International, which I work with, particularly focused on finance, because there were lots of civil society initiatives and they were terrific and they did marvelous things in mobilizing people, but they had a real issue in terms of scaling up. And the scaling up was a problem, not just about mobilizing people, which many organizations did very successfully through people's movements and generating a whole voice, if you like, about the issues. But there were problems in basic access. There was an issue about accessing land and there was an issue about accessing finance, let alone technical capacity to actually package all that stuff together in the complexity that large scale interventions require. And I think what those of us who were involved in the first establishment of the International Guarantee Fund and then in arguing the case for an international venture capital fund that would directly access people living in informal settlements, slums, whatever you want to call them, to the kind of development finance they needed to take a real lead role in settlement development. We had to engage with other people. We had to engage with banks and learn their language. We had to find techniques to put our foot in the door and keep that door open. And it was a long and it was a painful experience. And some of it led to real breakthroughs and a significant scaling. And an awful lot of it didn't, because there were constraints in terms of technical capacity to do things. There were constraints in terms of the banking sector wasn't developed. I mean, I can remember going to Cambodia and visiting Phnom Penh and visiting the only bank and the only bank manager and saying, well, would you be prepared to finance settlement upgrading? And he just laughed in my face. You know, he said, don't be ridiculous. You know, we're just trying to establish a financial sector here. So clearly, the financial markets have developed in all sorts of ways with globalization. And there's been a huge emphasis on the whole infrastructure that lies behind financialization and so forth. But the majority of people that we were dealing with then, and we're, you know, and people are, and people facing the phones are still outside of that. They don't have access to those services, and they don't have formal and legal access to that land. So they're they're indirectly, if you like, affected by the financialization because the subsidies are being grabbed for other purposes. And so I asked
Ruth, may I ask you one question so that you use your last minute and help us reflect on this? I think this how approach is extremely interesting. What I am wondering is if you would need to do the same thing, if you would come into this ecosystem now, like you came in before, would it be very different what you would be doing?
I think what I would do now is basically be much more rigorous about understanding the initiatives that have come up from the ground that have actually managed to scale up and work. And I know of a number of those that have been partially documented, but they have not been properly analysed and understood in terms of the financial processes involved and the level of capital that some of those community-based and driven processes have generated is enormous. I mean, it's millions and millions and millions of dollars that is circulating within civil society financial networks. And a lot of it's not even known about. And so I think there's a need to really understand what people like Sonia, who's going to be speaking later, have done, what's happened with the whole sort of Federation in India experience, what's happened with an organization I started with very early, IVDP. Get that knowledge out so that people can understand the strategic output, if you like, of the relationships that those organizations have formed, how they did it, and what they've learnt in terms of what works.
No, thank you very much for this perspective. I was looking at the chat, and I'm not surprised that it comes from someone from local government. I think that sometimes the challenges that we see, and I am biased in how I look at this, because of course I work with a sphere of government, a certain constituency. We face the trouble that affordable housing might never be competitive. I say might, although Eduard, who might be taking the floor later, says will never be competitive. It might not ever be competitive. So I think we also need to look at it from this perspective, and this is why I think looking at it from the perspective of rights is very, very important. That you will, otherwise you will not cover this universal need that we all have, and that is so basic for humanity and for human decency. So Ruth, keep this in mind, and I will come back to you in a second. Allow me now to go to Diana, principal researcher in International Institute for Environment and Development. And Diana, since you have heard already two other speakers, allow me then to ask you the same question, but ask you also to build on some of the issues that have been brought up before.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we were just trying to work out if you're going to see any slides or not. I'd prepared two. I'm not sure it's practical now. But good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also for the invitation. Incredibly exciting to be with you. I will try and build, of course, on what's been said before. I'm very appreciative of Adriana highlighting some of the key challenges. Also, Amelia, of you talking a little bit about the role and significance of local government. If I remember my sequencing without my photos, I might reference that. And I guess Raquel and Ruth, you provided a set of perspectives, I think, around the challenge to the welfare state and the challenge to rights, Raquel, but also the need to be really pragmatic in how we move forward. So we were asked to reflect on What's changed in the way we're approaching rights? And I wanted to flag 2 ideas. Thank you, that was super swift of UCLG. I really wanted to flag 2 ideas. Raquel moved from being pessimistic to optimistic. Apologies, I fear I will do the reverse. So I fear I will move from being optimistic to pessimistic. So I think the first trend I wanted to pick up on, and I would say neither of these trends are new. I think both of them were established some decades ago, but I think they are being strengthened. So I think that the language is changing. I think that we have moved away perhaps from a focus on rights, but the movements, the urban social movements, have moved to a focus on justice. And that seems to me to be important and significant. And I think in my mind, it reflects the fact that it can be easy to get governments to sign up to rights. Words are easy, changing practice is hard. And I'm going back almost to the mid-90s, I think, when talking to Alejandro Florien in Colombia, and he spoke about the movement's struggle to get the right to housing and the subsidy system in Colombia, but the feeling that it didn't address what was needed, really for the reason Ruth highlighted, the lack of scale. So I think movements have understood that justice cannot be achieved simply by rights, that rights are important, but we need to go beyond rights to a realization of rights. I think that reflects the fact that movements have caught up with the fact that states are sophisticated. Movements need to be sophisticated too. And I think there has been something of a frustration around social movements. Maybe Roseanne Sonia will comment on this. Something of frustration with academics, professionals, NGOs, who fall into the trap of asking for superficial change, but not substantive political reform. So that is my optimistic reading of how approaches have changed, that we understand more than rights is required, and we have in some sense, aligned to do that. This is actually a photo from Zimbabwe, from Bulawayo, about the Zimbabwe, and it shows the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation working with groups of people to challenge evictions in dialogue with local government and securing something that's better. Okay, if we could just go to the next slide. Emilia, I only have 2 slides. Please don't be alarmed. Okay, so the second trend I wanted to really highlight talks directly to Raquel's assessment. And we didn't collude, so please, participants, don't feel it's set up. So I think one of the ways in which government has responded to pressure to address the right to housing is through housing opportunities that are in many cases unaffordable. So this is a picture actually from Pune, and it reflects a response that the National Slum Dwellers made to a government program, Basic Services for the Urban Poor. So as movements pressed governments to address housing rights, and governments rolled out programs to address housing rights, in many cases, they were about incorporating low-income populations into a housing market. So in this case, actually quite a big subsidy. The Pune example worked relatively well, 90% subsidy. The Federation was able to support people to enter. In other places like Vizag, it was really a very hostile program where low-income people had to take big loans that they probably could not afford to repay. So I think that as there has been efforts to realize the right to housing, one response has been this marketization, even before you get to financialization. And I think we have got to realize that affordability has to be a contested agenda. Affordability is used absurdly as a euphemism. Affordable houses are not affordable in any sense. And we have to remember that when we talk about the affordability of housing, it is not simply housing and housing finance. It is water, sanitation, drainage. It is a whole bundle of services, which in too many cases are not affordable to the lowest income groups. So this is a pessimistic perspective. I wanted to really end with a bit of a challenge. I don't think our approach has moved far enough to contesting affordability as a concept and to contesting the way in which we are developing a set of solutions to address housing needs. So I want to finish there. I've thrown out my 2 ideas for what they're worth. And I just wanted to thank the organizers again for providing this platform for us to engage with these really critical themes.
Well, thank you very much. I think we all have the hope to continue these deliberations and to make sure that this kind of conversation also feed on concrete proposals to different actors on how to pursue this agenda. I think that's certainly why United Cities and Local Governments is here, and I am sure this is the case also for other partners in this event. As I give the floor to our discussants, I would like to just leave this in the room. I think it might be answers also in other panels. But I think we need to start also asking very concrete questions about the tools that we have in front of us. I mean, for a very long time, local governments have been left out of the conversation because it simply was not in the realm of competencies. Housing still is not in many cases. And what I am wondering now is whether we can achieve this affordability, justice, upscaling discourse, which I truly think is built on rights, by, for instance, promoting tools like public housing. Is public housing the answer, really? Is that what local governments need to be pushing for, or not, or is that wrong? I think there are many concrete questions like that our membership, our local governments are struggling with, and they might be making also the wrong investment and asking the wrong things to the national governments and to the private sector that they partner with. So I hope we can discuss some of that. But allow me to give the floor now to Arif Hassan, founder of the Urban Resource Center in Pakistan, to provide some reactions to what we have heard up until now, and obviously bring in some new ideas. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Can you hear me?
There you are. I can see you now. Wonderful.
You can see me also. Good. Great.
Go ahead.
Well, there were so many things that were said, and I think I don't need to say anything. Diana's more or less summed them up. But I will sort of talk about my experiences somewhat and the situation as it has evolved in the countries where I have worked, and there are remarkable similarities. First of all, Raquel's comment that the welfare state has been dismantled. I think that is universal. The welfare state has been dismantled, yes, but its ideas still linger on. The desire for it is still there. And it's very much a part of thinking of policymakers as well. It's also put down in documents on housing. However, in the actual practice of housing, it does not figure. And so it is very much something that is still there. It's not really finished. I think a very important point was raised by Ruth, and that is the constraints that are imposed by the nature of banking, its rules, regulations, the manner it functions, how it functions, its linkages. And that denies access to housing finance. So that is one area where there is a necessity of major interventions, but it's the most difficult thing to do because these are well-established institutions of a global nature and perhaps the most conservative of institutions. But apart from that, there are other aspects which I would like to point out. Before, we were trying to establish that there was something known as housing rights. And this was very much so in the 70s, I think, that there is such a thing, which was not accepted as something that existed. And this was because housing rights were there as a concept because of various advocacy groups rather than really projects as such that were establishing themselves at that time. And so the concept of housing rights, I think, is very present in academia, in civil society, in government policymakers. But the question is, why cannot this concept that is promoted again, like in my university as well, why can it not become a part of policy? Why cannot these successful projects that have been carried out, why do they remain simply as projects? And even if changes are made in them, in policy, that is limited to a certain area, that is limited to a certain arrondissement, to a certain district, rather than for the whole country. And I think the constraints to turning these into policy and upscaling them, I think they need to be recognized. It should not be, I think, as Ruth was saying, probably, should be, must be. No, the reason is, why is it not so? And for that, the understanding of who does what, how, and why becomes necessary. And this factor, I think, in most, a very important factor is missing in most researches. It's rather working towards an ideal rather than dealing with these very important questions of how housing is delivered, what for, what is behind it. Today, it's the market. It has been decided almost everywhere. Even in a city like Karachi, which is a poor city, the majority of housing today at enormous costs is delivered by the developers. And the subsidies that are provided for that housing, they are the main beneficiaries of that. And I think this trend is going to increase with the passage of time as the state withdraws from the entire housing delivery systems.
Thank you, Arif.
Sorry?
You need to wrap up.
I'm wrapping up. So,
good.
In my understanding of things, we have to have a very different approach to understanding housing. I think what we need to understand is the present situation and how it functions, because we are not going to do away with it like this. That understanding is crucial. And it has to be related to the global economic system and how it is evolving and affecting our societies and our country. I feel increasingly in the case of Pakistan that we have a public that is aware, that understands what the issues are. Larger coalitions need to be formed that can, some way or the other, affect policy making, that can affect government functioning. But for that, the necessary knowledge to understand the relationships that exist in producing the situation as it is today, I feel is very essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arif, for these words that actually build on many of the issues that the different speakers have raised. And from my perspective and what I have been hearing from you is that maybe we understand the housing crisis differently from if you look at it from different perspectives. My sense for a very large part of my membership for local governments around the world, the housing crisis has been understood as a financial crisis and not a human rights crisis or an injustice issue. And that is exactly what we need to change. And I sense, I am a little bit positive on this, and I might be wrong, but I sense that for my membership, that is what is starting to change. That we are understanding that very differently in different parts of the world. You've always had those that got it right. Huh? So I do hope that we can progress down that path. I think it is important to change the narrative, to actually change the actions and the policies. I am afraid I've been a very bad moderator because we've gone too far with all the comments, but it was impossible to stop you all. I mean, very interesting comments. Thank you for counting on us, for keeping local governments in mind. And I give it back to you, Adriana, to go with the next session. Thank you for this opportunity. And thank you to all the speakers for the wonderful inputs.
Thank you so much, Emilia. I will keep comments for the end. Thanks a lot to all the speakers. I see some interesting and even, provocations and even some intention, but definitely a lot of food for thought. I know we are a bit behind. To the audience, please keep on adding any comments, any questions on the chat, and we will, if we catch up a bit more with time, we will try to engage with your voice directly. But I don't want to delay more to give the floor to Barbara, my colleague Barbara Lipietz. So what we are doing now is we are moving into an exploration that we don't want to polarize. I think that, we're saying that, claiming rights or using the rights language and realizing them on the ground are equally important and extraordinarily necessary together. It's not that you opt for one or the other. But we thought, well, let's start by, exploring in more detail. If we dive into how we are working on the claiming rights on the ground, not at the United Nations, then, what are our tactics? What is working, what is not, and what needs to change? Barbara, the floor is yours.